American History Recap. JFK's response to Soviet aggression during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy responded by placing a naval blockade, which he referred to as a quarantine, around Cuba. He also demanded the removal of the missiles and the destruction of the sites. The domino theory. The domino theory was a Cold War policy that suggested a communist government in one nation would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states, each falling like a perfectly aligned row of dominoes. In Southeast Asia, the U.S. government used the now discredited domino theory to justify its involvement in the Vietnam War and its support for a non-communist dictator in South Vietnam. President Johnson escalating the involvement of the U.S. in Vietnam. China had become communist in 1949 and communists were in control of North Vietnam. The USA was afraid that communism would spread to South Vietnam and then the rest of Asia. It decided to send money, supplies and military advisors to help the South Vietnamese government. Roy Benavides, a 33-year-old master sergeant, volunteered to help rescue a dozen or so soldiers wounded during a reconnaissance mission and surrounded by about 1,000 North Vietnamese troops. Armed only with a knife, Benavides jumped from a helicopter and ran through gunfire, suffering wounds to his leg, face and head. He set up a defense line and helped the badly wounded soldiers into the aircraft. During the rescue attempt, the helicopter pilot was shot and the hovering aircraft crashed. Benavides then pulled the wounded out of the overturned aircraft, provided them with water and directed airstrikes on enemy positions while awaiting a second attempt to evacuate the wounded. The response to the Vietnam War by the silent majority. The group believed that it spoke for a silent center of Americans by suggesting that a premature American withdrawal from the war would have disastrous consequences for world peace and domestic tranquility. The silent majority was a term widely used by President Richard Nixon in the late 1960s. Nixon perceived that a large contingent of Americans didn't feel represented amidst the voices of dissent that largely defined the time period, which he called the silent majority. The Vietnam War was a long, costly and divisive conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The conflict was intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. More than 3 million people, including over 58,000 Americans, were killed in the Vietnam War, and more than half of the dead were Vietnamese civilians. Many Americans opposed the war on moral grounds, appalled by the devastation and violence of the war. Others claimed the conflict was a war against Vietnamese independence, or an intervention in a foreign civil war. Others opposed it because they felt it lacked clear objectives and appeared to be unwinnable. The anti-war movement began mostly on college campuses, as members of the leftist organization Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, began organizing teach-ins to express their opposition to the way in which it was being conducted. National Archives and Records Administration. Sentiment to lower the nation's voting age dates back to WWII. As American involvement in the war increased, President Roosevelt sought to increase the size of the nation's military and lowered the draft age of young men from 21 to 18 years old. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, also known as the War Powers Act, is a congressional resolution designed to limit the U.S. president's ability to initiate or escalate military actions abroad. Politics refers to enacting or engaging in diplomatic or political policies based primarily on considerations of given circumstances and factors, rather than strictly binding itself to explicit ideological notions. Détente came to be because of this. Détente was designed to relax tensions with the Soviet Union, reduce nuclear arsenals, and limit military commitments. Nixon's 1972 visit to China ushered in a new era of U.S.-China relations and effectively removed China as a Cold War foe. The Nixon administration signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with the Soviet Union and organized a conference that led to the signing of the Helsinki Accords after Nixon left office. The 7-day official visit to 3 Chinese cities was the first time a U.S. president had visited the PRC. Nixon's arrival in Beijing ended 25 years of no communication or diplomatic ties between the two countries. U.S. role trying to end the Cold War, as the Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe, The United States embarked on a policy of containment to prevent the spread of Soviet and Communist influence in Western European nations such as France, Italy, and Greece. During 1989 and 1990, the Berlin Wall came down, borders opened, and free elections ousted communist regimes everywhere in Eastern Europe. Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, including the peace through strength, was to develop a sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system in order to prevent missile attacks from other countries, specifically the Soviet Union. Peace through strength is a phrase that suggests that military power can help preserve peace. The American civil rights movement started in the mid-1950s. A major catalyst in the push for civil rights was in December 1955, when NAACP activist Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white man. Read about Rosa Parks and the mass bus boycott she sparked. In 1954, the civil rights movement gained momentum when the United States Supreme Court made segregation illegal in public schools in the case of Brown v. Board of Education. President Truman pledged to desegregate the military. Truman bolstered the Civil Rights Division, appointed the first African American judge to the federal bench, named several other African Americans to high-ranking administration positions, and most important, on July 26, 1948, he issued an executive order abolishing segregation in the armed forces. The 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments prohibited slavery, granted citizenship rights to all people born or naturalized in the United States regardless of race, and prohibited governments from infringing on voting rights based on race or past servitude. Civil rights activists, known for their fight against social injustice and their lasting impact on the lives of all oppressed people, include Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm. Resistance to racial segregation and discrimination with strategies such as civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance, marches, protests, boycotts, freedom rides, and rallies received national attention as newspaper, radio, and television reporters and cameramen documented the struggle to end racial inequality. Different methods of attaining civil rights. The most popular strategies used in the 1950s and first half of the 1960s were based on the notion of nonviolent civil disobedience and included such methods of protest as boycotts, freedom rides, voter registration drives, sit-ins, and marches. Johnson's Great Society policies birthed Medicare, Medicaid, the Older Americans Act, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, (AC), of 1965. All of which remain government programs in 2021. The main goal was the total elimination of poverty and racial injustice. New major spending programs that addressed education, medical care, urban problems, rural poverty, and transportation were launched during this period. Civil rights laws and the impact on American society. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex or national origin, is considered one of the crowning legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. January 20, 2022, LBJ's legacy provided better access to home mortgages and a rent subsidy program. Johnson's Great Society policies birthed Medicare, Medicaid, the Older Americans Act, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, (AC), of 1965. All of which remain government programs, kept Americans out of poverty and ensured fundamental rights of citizenship for minorities. Civil rights movement changes after 1965. The civil rights movement began to change after 1965. Some African Americans began to reject the calls for nonviolent protests. These people wanted changes to occur much more quickly. They demanded action now, rather than the slower changes that usually came from peaceful demonstrations. Betty Friedman wrote a book, The Feminine Mystique, exploring the idea of women finding a better purpose outside of their traditional roles. Now, defended rights, a cause made more prominent by the National Abortion Rights Action League, and sexual harassment laws, to promote full equality in the military, including combat duty, and to secure greater federal funding for child care, including voting rights and gender equality, women's equal access to education, their increased participation in politics and the workplace, their access to abortion and birth control, the existence of resources to aid domestic violence and rape victims. The disadvantages, however, were the women's movement did not succeed in finding equality, as the movement produced discrimination toward minority groups, created an unforgettable backlash of radical feminism as a whole, and caused women to fix the inequalities. The LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, founded in 1929, is the oldest and most widely respected Hispanic civil rights organization in the United States of America. LULAC was created at a time in our country's history when Hispanics were denied basic civil and human rights, despite contributions to American society. The founders of LULAC created an organization that empowers its members to create and develop opportunities where they are needed most. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, two of the most significant leaders in the American farmer workers movement. Cesar Chavez was an American farm worker, labor leader, and civil rights activist who, with Dolores Huerta, co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers, UFW. Chavez and Huerta hoped a union of farm workers could agitate for higher wages and help with rising rents in migrant camps. As migrants, they rented houses or campsites, often from the very people for whom they labored. AIM's initial actions were meant to bolster Minneapolis's native population. To aid victims of police abuse, they formed the AIM Patrol. AIM also helped establish the Legal Rights Center, which provided free representation to the poor, and the Indian Health Board, which provided native-centric medical care. The main strategy for the AIM was attracting press. AIM would set up protests and marches to get the press to follow, so that they were able to broadcast their problems and what they were fighting for. On Thanksgiving Day, 1970, AIM seized the replica of the Mayflower in Boston, and another time, they occupied Mount Rushmore in protest. One of the marches was called the Longest Walk, in which the AIM lead the spiritual walk across the country, to Washington, D.C., in support of tribal sovereignty and bring attention to anti-Indian legislation. Powell v. Alabama. 9 black youths, described as young, ignorant, and illiterate, were accused of raping 2 white women. Alabama officials sprinted through the legal proceedings. A total of 3 trials took 1 day and all 9 were sentenced to death. Alabama law required the appointment of counsel in capital cases, but the attorneys did not consult with their clients and had done little more than appear to represent them at the trial. Shelley v. Kremer, 1948, is a U.S. Supreme Court case that held that restrictive covenants in real property deeds which prohibited the sale of property to non-Caucasians unconstitutionally violate the equal protection provision of the 14th Amendment. Brown v. Board of Education. On May 17, 1954, the court declared that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, effectively overturning the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision mandating separate but equal. The Brown ruling directly affected legally segregated schools in 21 states. In 1958, 2 residents of Virginia, Mildred Jeter, a black woman, and Richard Loving, a white man, were married in the District of Columbia. The Lovings returned to Virginia shortly thereafter. The couple was then charged with violating the state's anti-miscegenation statute, which banned interracial marriages. The Lovings were found guilty and sentenced to a year in jail. The trial judge agreed to suspend the sentence if the Lovings would leave Virginia and not return for 25 years. In a unanimous decision, the court held that the Equal Protection Clause required that Sweet be admitted to the university. The court found that the law school for Negroes, which was to have opened in 1947, would have been grossly unequal to the University of Texas Law School. Voting is a very important part of any democracy. By voting, citizens are participating in the democratic process. Citizens vote for leaders to represent them and their ideas, and the leaders support the citizens' interests. Process of becoming a naturalized citizen. I'm the U.S. Step 1. Determine if you are already a U.S. citizen. Step 2. Determine if you are eligible to become a U.S. citizen. Step 3. Prepare your Form N-400, application for naturalization. Step 4. Submit your Form N-400 and pay your fees. Step 5. Go to your biometrics appointment, if applicable. Step 6. Complete the interview. Step 7. Receive a decision from us on your Form N-400. Step 8. Receive a notice to take the oath of allegiance. Step 9. Take the oath of allegiance to the United States. Step 10. Understanding U.S. citizenship. The Watergate scandal refers to the burglary and illegal wiretapping of the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, in the Watergate complex, by members of President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign and the subsequent cover-up of the break-in resulting in Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974, as well as other abuses of power by the Nixon White House that were discovered during the course of the scandal. The Watergate scandal resulted in 69 government officials being charged and 48 being found guilty. In result, it weakened the executive privilege of the president. The Teapot Dome scandal involved Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, who accepted large sums of money and valuable gifts from private oil companies. In exchange, Fall allowed the companies to control government oil reserves in Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming. In December, lawyers for Paula Jones, who was suing the president on sexual harassment charges, subpoenaed Lewinsky. In January 1998, allegedly under the recommendation of the president, Lewinsky filed an affidavit in which she denied ever having had a sexual relationship with him. 5 days later, Tripp contacted the office of Kenneth Starr, the Whitewater Independent Counsel, to talk about Lewinsky and the tapes she made of their conversations. After nearly 14 hours of debate, the House of Representatives approves 2 articles of impeachment against President Bill Clinton, charging him with lying under oath to a federal grand jury and obstructing justice. Iran-Contra affair scandal, a secret operation in which the U.S. government secretly sent weapons to a known enemy and sent financial aid to a rebel force. Both of those actions were illegal. Senior Reagan administration officials secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, the subject of an arms it contradicted government policy by negotiating with terrorists and illegally funding the Contras. Why did President Reagan withdraw U.S. Marines from Lebanon in 1984? Hundreds of Marines were killed in a deadly explosion. Effects political scandals have on the public. Political scandals are an indicator of freedom of speech, an open and aggressive media and strong political competition. Emil Durkheim's ideas on social cohesion have a particular resonance in liberal democracies, and raise the question of whether scandals can only occur in liberal democracies. Scandals enable an interrogation of the collective moral code, and public opinion is used to punish the deviant behavior of politicians, who are elevated to a symbolic position of moral authority.